So it is based on an error that's having massive consequences.
It is an error, and it's not just an error in the math. The whole concept of defining a tariff solely based on the trade deficit the U.S. has with another country is conceptually flawed. So just on top of that, they made another error, which actually, even if you buy the way that they created this formula, it overstates tariffs by a factor of 4. And in fact, if you applied the right parameters, you would have the vast majority of countries having the minimum 10% tariff, and the maximum tariff would be 14%.
So essentially, whether you have a trade deficit or a trade surplus, you will get slapped with a tariff of 10%. Is that a good way of looking at it?
That is the way that the tariffs have been implemented. Economically, of course, that's not a good way of looking at it. If you really wanted to get reciprocal tariffs, you'd have to do the hard work of figuring out exactly the tariffs that other countries place on the various products that they export into the United States. You'd have to calculate some of the non-tariff trade barriers that they do impose. I actually have heard some of that work was done within the White House, but the president ended up ignoring that analysis and instead decided that the tariff should depend only on the trade deficit with a given country. And the problem is that while it's true that a trade deficit would depend in part on tariffs, it also depends on a lot of other factors, such as comparative advantage. So what types of goods that a country is particularly positioned to produce and whether the U.S. would be consuming those goods depends on geography and numerous other factors. And so you really cannot create a formula for a tariff solely based on the trade deficit.
Including international trade flows as well. If you take a look at the tariffs being imposed by the Trump administration, we're looking at 26% for India, where I am right now, 34% for China, 46% for Vietnam, 50% for a small nation like Lesotho, which is among the poorest nation in the continent. I'm just wondering, if you were to remove the error, what kind of tariffs should these countries be implemented with?
Sure. If you remove the error, it's a very easy calculation. Just take whatever the tariff is that the Trump administration published for each country, divide it by 4, and that's essentially your new tariff. And so if you believe, again, their formula, the highest you would have is about 14% or a little bit less than that. Now, I would not suggest that those are the correct tariff rates. I mean, if we're trying to do reciprocal tariffs, which I am not a fan of even, but if you wanted to do that, you again would need to do the work of calculating what their tariffs actually are placing on the U.S., add in the non-tariff barriers, and that would be the right place to start. But I think the president just doesn't think about it in that terms. He believes that if there's a trade deficit with a country, that means that country is cheating us. And that's just not true, especially when you get to some of these lower income countries that just simply are not consuming some of the goods that we're producing, and they get it from other countries. There's a lot of countries out there, and there's a lot of flows between them, and it just doesn't make any sense to punish other countries, first of all, but mostly to punish ourselves. It's going to increase when we put tariffs on. Consumers pay a portion of that increase in prices. It's going to make it harder for businesses to have any certainty in the U.S. About investment decisions, and you end up hurting everybody. And I think that's why you're seeing such a large market reaction in terms of the stock market and in terms of increased probability of entering a recession in the U.S. So this is good for nobody.
Kevin, there is a quotation here which says, nobody knows anything. Those responsible, those implementing, have no idea what they're doing. First, do you agree with that? And secondly, if you had to make sense of what's happening right now with those tariffs, how would you do it?
Yeah, I think it really comes down to there's just conflicting motivations. I mean, some people, I think, within the administration, want to raise money, import. If you tax imports, that's going to raise money for the Treasury. Some people see this as a way to create more manufacturing jobs in the U.S. Some see it as a negotiating ploy to say we want to have free trade everywhere. And I just think, no, there's not really an alignment of what the ultimate goal is here. And I think that is a big problem. Aside from the policy itself, it just creates total uncertainty. So if you're a country who wants to say, oh, wow, I really want to comply, I want to not face these big tariffs for things that we're exporting into the United States, I don't think they would know what to do because we're not giving them, the Trump administration is not giving them any kind of clear direction. So I think that's like just the clarity of what the goal is and then what countries need to do to comply would be an important step. Again, like the fundamental thing is we shouldn't want a trade war in the first place, but if you're going to declare a trade war, at least define the terms clearly.
Another head scratcher, I think, is the trade war over fentanyl. That doesn't make much sense either.
Right. So this was an earlier motivation. So it seems that the motivations for the trade war have changed day to day and month to month. And I think this goes back to the lack of clarity. But, this started a month ago, actually a couple of months ago. The Trump administration decided to impose tariffs on our two neighboring countries, the Canada and Mexico, under the guise of fentanyl. Now, fentanyl is a very serious problem. The drug epidemic in the United States claims 100,000 lives or more per year at a staggering economic cost, not only to our economy, but also just the lives lost in senseless ways. So it's a huge problem. But the problem is that it's not caused, you can't solve the fentanyl problem by putting tariffs particularly on Canada. I mean, a lot of fentanyl does come through the southern border from Mexico. Fortunately, they've been cooperating with us to help alleviate those flows. 0.2% of all the fentanyl that comes to the U.S. comes to the border with Canada. And so that just suggested to me, like, the administration isn't serious about these other reasons. It wasn't serious about the drug war. It was serious about putting tariffs on our neighboring countries simply because they are a large source of imports into the U.S.
Kevin, I want to touch on China just because Trump said just overnight that he's considering 50% additional tariffs on China. I'm just wondering, where should those tariffs be without the error?
I see. So again, if you take their formula, with China, there's been a layering of other tariffs on top of original tariffs. So I'd have to go back to our table and what they published for China. But I think with China, it's a little bit different to some of the other countries. There are some concerns about unfair trade practices that they engage in. So I think there can be reasonable ways to deal with China. I worry a lot about completely escalating this back and forth.